Coming in at number 5, the Corwin Witch House. The Jonathan Corwin House in Salem, or simply known better as the Witch House, was the home of Judge Jonathan Corwin, 1640 to 1718, a prominent figure in the horrors that happened there, and is actually the only structure you can visit in Salem today that has direct ties to the Salem witch trials of 1692. Well, that might not be the case because we got a couple of those coming up. Trust me, this place is riddled with ties to those witches. Corwin bought the house in 1675 and lived there for more than 40 years. The Witch House is a 350-year-old thick building with black painted timber, 2.5 stories tall, built to last, massive and looming. Located at 310 Essex Street in the historic district of Salem, the house stands in testimony to the witch trials, and it's believed that the Witch House was used by Jonathan Corwin and others to actually interrogate those accused of witchcraft. The Witch House remained with the Corwins, of course, until the mid-1800s, yet there wasn't many family around to liven it up. The Corwin curse seems like a weird one since all the Corwin's kids, 5 children, all perished young from separate complications within the house. And this is where it gets really weird. Not only is the place haunted to hell and back with specters seen in the attic upstairs and loud voices, arguments heard in the empty house at night, 8 Corwin lives were lost to premature death in that house. All Corwins. Yeah, I'd say that makes for a pretty cursed home, alright? A family curse. Number 4, Proctors Ledge. There are over 1,000 documents from Salem witch trials, yet none of the accounts actually specify where the hangings took place. For many years it was believed that the 19 people who were executed in Salem were hanged at the summit of Gallows Hill, on the edge of town to the west, where the town would meet for large gatherings. Seems like after some homework, the hill alone would be too hard to climb, not an ideal spot to hear or see the live trials, and was too thick and heavily wooded. Maps of 1700 Salem show Gallows Hill marked on the map, but no actual marker for the execution site. I feel like a detective all of a sudden. A team of researchers began to reconsider all of the evidence around 2010, eras of homework collected over the years, and eventually concluded that the real execution spot was Proctors Ledge. Boom, baby! This was confirmed in 2016. Part of the evidence included 1692 eyewitnesses' accounts who wrote in journals that they were able to see the hangings from their homes to actually remains being dug up and found now. Now I know what you're thinking, it's named after John Proctor. No, it's not. However, odd timing as he was one of the witches accused of witchcraft along with 3 of his other mistresses. Locals say that the lady in white visits Proctor's Ledge. Some visitors claim to have caught the sight of her, though others catch only her disembodied voice. Are these the phantoms of the unsettled spirits tied to the grounds where they were hanged for eternity? Who knows? Number 3, Charter Street Burial Grounds. The Charter Street Burial Grounds started in 1637, also known as Old Burying Point or the Charter Street Cemetery, is the oldest cemetery in Salem. Many early and famous Salem residents are buried here, such as John Hawthorne, a judge in the Salem witch trials of 1692. Hawthorne, whose father had been a Salem magistrate, was born in 1641 and had 6 children. Hawthorne experienced several deaths in his family, including those of all his 3 brothers. Hawthorne died in 1717 at the age of 76, never apologizing for the role in the Salem witch trials. His headstone is surrounded by granite rectangles to help preserve what is left of the original stone. Being one of the oldest cemeteries and the sickening things that happen there, ghosts and spirits are often seen around the gravesite. There have been many strange occurrences here. Witch stuff aside, about 400 years of ghostly encounters have happened at the Old Burying Point Cemetery. Over the years, people have successfully captured EVP of voices from beyond the grave at the site. If you can hear me, say something. Stop yelling. Oh, sorry. Photographs of mysterious shadows, orbs, white mist, and even full apparitions are seen here. One of these apparitions is believed to be Mary Bright Corey, who died 1684. She was the second wife of Giles Corey, who later became an unfortunate victim of the witch trials himself. Another ghost seen is the powdered blue dress lady, whilst holding a picnic basket in one hand and sometimes accompanied by a young boy. Normally, once the cameras come out, the lady in white transitions into numerous bright orbs or vanishes altogether. Maybe the ghost woman is the same Mary Corey forever watching over Judge Hawthorne's grave. Number 2, Gallows Hill. Okay, so we were just talking about what happened to some of the accused during these hysterical trials and all the historical places that saw such violence. One of the most interesting witches tried of that was Giles Corey. Tried as a witch, but never hanged. Actually, the old man known as Giles Corey was pressed to death with the judge's orders of him being a strong and stubborn old man and would not for the life of him indulge in the nonsense he was being accused for. He never admitted that he was a witch, even throughout his torture. They laid him down and put a board on his back and proceeded to stone him to death, piling up stones on the board, resulting in crushing and eventually perishing underneath it. Only took about 4 days. Giles Corey apparently repeatedly yelled more weight, further cementing his plea of not guilty to everyone watching at Gallows Hill. With his last breath, Giles apparently cursed the town of Salem, and this area is now an unearthly hotspot for paranormal activity. The Gallows Hill that most people are aware of is nothing but a baseball diamond, but underneath that baseball diamond, bone fragments and coffins have been found. Interesting, because no witches were ever buried in coffins. Maybe vampires? Giles died from his inflicted torture on September 19th, 1692, just after the 8th anniversary of his wife Mary's passing. Strange sounds emerge from the area at night, including loud knockings, thumpings that wake up neighbors from their bed, and, of course, the full-bodied apparitions said to walk the grounds yelling in the middle of the night. There have been full-bodied apparitions spotted within the woods, with disembodied voices shrieking in the middle of the night. The disturbingly loud voices yelled throughout the area have had some locals scratching their heads. Is this the ghost of Giles himself, speaking his curse upon the town for all to hear? Shh! Trying to sleep! And coming in at number 1, House of Seven Gables. Locals say the Turner Ingersoll Mansion, or also known as famously the House of Seven Gables, is the most haunted spot in Salem. How many haunted spots are there? Ghosts are just like really competitive. Now a prominent museum, protected in its original form, used for plays and reenactments by the locals, the original structure was simple in nature, with only 2.5 rooms and just under 3 stories tall. By the time of John Turner's death, the prominent merchant, sea captain, and owner of the house, he was one of the most wealthy men in the entirety of Massachusetts. Turner and Ingersoll's House of the Seven Gables is a ghostly reminder of the tormented souls both trying and being tried at the time of the hangings. But the Turner Ingersoll is a reminder for more than just lost shipping fortunes and curses, as it's also a homely reminder of Judge Hawthorne himself and the guilt he inflicted on that town. As records show, Hawthorne may have feigned sympathy for the accused witches, but he never regretted his involvement in their trials or executions. And he certainly never expressed any remorse during the trials themselves for sending the accused to their death. Following the witch hysteria of the late 1600s, the Hawthorne family lost most of their wealth, no doubt influenced by the families of the accused witches who sought out justice for their dead loved ones. Acting now is only a museum of historic place. Each year, the museum hosts a series of theatrical plays, all of which surrounding the Salem witch trials. Such plays titled as Legacy of the Hanging, Judge Hawthorne, and Spirits of the Gables. But some of the actors aren't, well, very alive. As for the ghosts outside of the theatrical performances, well, everybody's got their own opinions on that. But tour guides and employees tend to avoid the attic, where some people have complained about being choked by ghostly figures. Attack! Local lore has many different stories to tell, and so do many of the visitors who enter Salem's most haunted house. Others report seeing a phantom boy who enjoys playing in the attic. Throughout the day, his giggles and laughs can be heard. Always giggling kids, eh? They're like the scariest ghosts. Well, that's about all the proof and lore I need to believe it. Imagine doing a show and a ghost just saying, line?
Kicking off at number 5, Wentworth Woodhouse. Back in December of 2017, a group of investigators known as Soul Reaper Paranormal headed out to Rotherham, South Yorkshire to Wentworth Woodhouse, a 17th century private estate that is notorious as a paranormal hotspot. The paranormal investigation team did an entire sweep of the 23,000 square yard building, but within just 2 minutes of being there, they caught this perplexing footage. Allegedly, the team described the apparition as being the same height as a child, and after standing in direct view of the cameraman, appeared to float through the wall as if trying to lead the team in a certain direction. The team described the spirit as being awash with residual energy, which is interesting because the majority of these apparitions can be explained away as a lens flare or a flicker of light, but in this case, the shape still holds its form even though when the footage is inverted. Interesting, right? Well, what do you guys think? Next up at number 4, Sounds from the Basement. Admittedly, this is an audio video, so I'll give you fair credit for feeling a little cheated. However, the content of this minute-long YouTube video is so strangely disturbing that I just had to make this list. Published over a decade ago in 2007, YouTuber Don Garvey responded to a homeowner that had regularly heard strange, unsettling noises coming from their basement, and so, along with a paranormal investigation team, set up some rudimentary audio recording equipment in the basement to see what was going on. After 3 days of capturing no compelling explanation, on the fourth night, just after 3 AM, they realized that there was something down there making an otherwise otherworldly racket. Now, Don has defended this footage for over a decade, regularly explaining that the footage was completely unedited other than being amplified, and maintaining that he still has no explanation for the ghostly sound. Either he's got one hell of a poker face, or he really did capture the wailing of a disturbed spirit. Coming in at number 3, Dreamwater Lounge. And we're going back to England again because we all know that's where the spookiest stuff happens, right? In 2015, some pretty unnerving CCTV footage was captured at the Dreamwater Lounge wine bar in Stockton Heath, Cheshire, following decades of reports from staff of strange happenings on the property who regularly complained of an unsettling feeling throughout. Well, at 1 minute 15, the CCTV camera captures what appears to be an incredibly clear silhouette of a figure moving throughout the corridor before disappearing and the camera shaking back to normality. Well, horror fans, I've got to be honest with you, the reason that I chose this clip for our number 3 spot, right in the middle, is because, well, it's a fake. A very good fake, but still an obviously doctored piece with some very clear tampered editing to propagate a paranormal story. Remember, it's important to be vigilant when facing the unexplainable. At 37 seconds when the lights cut, it appears to rain on the camera. However, the streak marks seem to take away the hard-coded date and timestamp, which just doesn't happen. It's not on the camera lens in any way, unless the spirit possesses the power to cause digital precipitation, which, who knows? Well, we will leave the link to this video in the info box so you can check it out for yourself and let us know your thoughts in the comment box down below. Next up at number 2, Gettysburg Ghosts.
Right there. See? Look.
There's nobody there.
Which, compared to our previous point, is definitely a video that myself, as well as the majority of the internet, find incredibly difficult to explain away because it's just so weird, and the perfect example of a difficult to explain ghost video. This is heralded by many as the most genuine paranormal footage ever captured, and has held that title ever since it was filmed way back when, in November of 2001. Husband and wife duo Delia and Tim Underwood were visiting the triangular field at Gettysburg on a day trip with their grandchildren, when after filming the site they noticed something appear along the tree line. Shapes, figures, almost too clear to be true figures of what appeared to be American Civil War soldiers moving in formation. Now, I'm going to level with you guys, I've tried to look as critically as possible at this footage and I'm still stumped. The video quality is low at best, which would make any post editing pretty obvious. There's none of that. Other than several very unlikely lens flares, I don't have an explanation. Check it out for yourselves and let us know your thoughts in the comment box down below. And finally, at our number 1 spot, Thing in the Hallway. Now, it's important to remember that this piece of footage was made for entertainment, but still, I think the possibility of it being tampered with is incredibly low, and nevertheless, it doesn't make it any less terrifyingly weird. Ghost Stalkers, a short-lived paranormal documentary series from veteran investigator John E.L. Tenney, featured an episode where himself and his assistant spent the night alone in violently haunted locations. It's important to note that this episode was the only television show to ever capture a full-body apparition on camera, and that's kind of a big deal. The figure that has now become known as the Tall Man was filmed inside the Old Taylor Memorial Hospital in Hawkinsville, Georgia, a notorious hotspot for the paranormal, and well, I'm pretty sure the show's creators couldn't believe their eyes after capturing one of the most chilling pieces of paranormal evidence ever. Again, we'll leave the link in the info box down below so you can check it out in full. Yeah, that's some pretty spooky stuff.
Number 5. Walking Dead. My first true tale of phantasmic terror comes to us from Reddit user Jalcott. Answering a question posed in the thread, nurses and doctors of Reddit, what's the weirdest and most paranormal thing you've ever experienced? Hospitals already seem pretty haunted as is, so it's no surprise that there was so many good answers. But Jalcott stood out. Take a listen. I'm a psychiatric nurse, and early on in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. One of our residents was an elective mute, which means that he didn't talk, but there was no medical reasoning as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life, and in fact seemed quite normal back then, with the exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the deep south and joined the army when he was 19, but one night he vanished. He was declared AWOL, and eventually he was declared missing, and later officially declared dead. However, 10 years later, a 7-foot tall man walked into a Virginia hospital ER in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Deschênes, and I've been dead for 10 years. And according to the Redditor, those were the last words he ever spoke to anyone. He had shown up to the hospital covered in dust and wearing an old uniform that he'd been wearing the night he vanished. His social security had not been used at all, and he had no ID on him whatsoever. However, via fingerprints, they were able to identify him. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man and that whoever was claiming to be him simply wasn't, and asked to never be contacted again." The nurse went on to add that Marion would pace all day, every day, moving his mouth in a way that looked like he was muttering to himself, but nothing came out when he moved his lips. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open as if he was laughing hysterically, but not so much as a breath could ever be heard. The nurse said she tried talking to him almost daily, and he would appear to listen, but only reacts by periodically throwing his head back in that laughter mimicking way of his. Various medications and treatment plans were pursued, but nothing ever affected him. Therapy was tried as well, but all that would happen was Marion would just grin and start pacing again. She goes on to say that on her last day, she saw Marion pacing in the parking lot, throwing back his head to laugh. She closes by saying all those years she'd wondered, was he a ghost? And all those years later, she still doesn't know. Click through and listen to as many top 5 scary videos as your ears can handle. Moving on. Number 4, things that go bunk in the night. Now you would never ever believe this, but our next story comes from Reddit as well. A similar thread, a similar question. What's the most paranormal thing you've ever experienced? Lots of good ones to pick from, but this one from Mad Rampager really stood out for me. I used to be in the military. The training camp bunk that we lived in was said to be haunted. Occasionally, our stuff would go missing and reappear in weird places, like under our bed or inside a bag that we'd zipped up and stuff. No big deal, right? Weird things happen, and I mean human error and all that. Well, then came the instance that freaked everybody out. It was night after lights out, and my friend was on his phone texting his girlfriend. Most of us had been drifting off to sleep and we were lying on our beds when suddenly my friend heard the shuffling of feet from the corridor. So, thinking that it was our sergeant, he quickly hid his phone under his pillow, rolled over on his side, and tried to get to sleep. What happened next still chills me to the bone to this day. While he pretended to sleep, he heard someone right behind him at the other end of the bed saying, "Don't worry, you can continue to pretend to sleep." I could have dismissed this as a figment of his imagination, except me and 5 other people around him heard it. Creepier still, there was no one there. And weirdly, it sounded like the voice of a young girl that had said it. For reference, our camp was in the middle of an island and was set up away from the main admin building. The island had been closed by the government for army training purposes for the past 15 years, so there were definitely no civilians around, let alone any children. To make matters freakier, when we came back from our weekend home leave, there was a bunch of hair on his bed, neatly bundled up, long and jet black, and underneath his pillow was a note. Remember me? Now, as I said, we're in the middle of a forest, in the middle of an island, and at that point in time, there were no female recruits whatsoever on the island. Our bunks were locked for the weekend, and the duty sergeant had no idea what had happened. We never spoke about it again after that night, and it still chills me every time I think about it. Number 3, old friends. Our next story is from a Reddit thread asking, "What's your ghost story?" And I gotta point this one out just because it was too funny, but the original poster included the title in brackets, "Serious?" to deter any would-be paranormal pranksters. Just serious ghost stories, please. Luckily, Redditors obliged. User Barbed Cats shared this terrifying tale. When I was 37, I went to my high school reunion. I flew into the nearest airport and rented a car. The distance was about 35 miles through a very rural and almost abandoned part of the country. About 3 miles outside of town, I see someone on the side of the road flagging me down. Up in the North Woods, no one ever leaves someone else stranded, and it would turn out that the guy standing there was somebody I'd actually been to school with, my old friend Jim. Jim gets in the car and we start talking, catching up. I hadn't seen him in 20 years, but he still looked the same, maybe just a little bit older. We get to town and I ask him if he wants to come to the reunion with me and have a drink. He says no, just take me back home. Jim's parents had lived only a few blocks from my grandmother's, and I turned in that direction, but he said to take him to the part of town that really was just the outskirts, up by the fairground and the cemetery. There was a mobile home park out there, and I figured that must be where he lived. When we reached the end of the turn, he said, just drop me off here. It was nice to see you again, and he walked off into the night. So I went to the high school reunion, met up with some old classmates, and we start to talk. Now please understand me here. I am stone cold sober, nor do I ever take anything harder than soda. Tired after a 13-hour flight, but I was completely sober. As we were talking about who was showing up and who wasn't, I mentioned to my old classmate that I just picked Jim up a few miles off east of town and had dropped him up by the fairgrounds. Now for some reason everyone got really quiet. Even the guy belting out karaoke stopped, and my cousin went white as a shirt. Barb. Jim died 8 years ago. Rolled his car. I start to feel really dizzy, and I go out to the car to take some deep breaths and decide whether or not I'm going crazy. And there on the seat was a newspaper printed 8 years ago containing Jim's obituary. I still have that damn paper. Every now and again I take it out to stare at it, and I still wonder just what the hell happened that night. Number 2. Ghost on the line. The next story comes to us from a thread asking law enforcement officers of Reddit what is the creepiest call that you've ever been on. We get a very creepy answer from user Smokey Bonaparte sharing this creepy little tale. The Redditor writes, 911 dispatcher calling in. We received a call from an elderly lady who had trouble breathing. I had taken several calls from her before and her husband in the past, so I recognized the voice. I dispatched an ambulance to her residence and held her on the line trying to keep her calm while the ambulance was responding. Ambulances advised that they had a 15-minute ETA as she was in a very rural part of West Virginia. I'm talking to her just about her husband and how she was doing, and just making pretty standard small talk with her. The ambulance arrives and I let them know that she is in severe respiratory distress, and I still had her on the line. I let her know the ambulance is coming to her door, to go answer the door, and she says okay, and hangs up the phone. Oh, that's pretty normal, right? Well, here's where it gets very weird. The EMT and paramedic on scene call back about a minute after, and they say that no one is answering the door. We have a sheriff in the area pulling on scene about that time. The sheriff unit confirmed the address, and he's breaching the door to make access to the PT. 5 minutes go by, and the paramedic on scene radios to ask me who called. I tell him it was the elderly woman who lived on residence. He tells me he's going to call this in and he needs to speak with my shift supervisor. We get him over to the supervisor, and the supervisor confirms the same information I relayed, that it was all correct, and asks what's going on. Apparently the old woman had been dead for a while and was already in full rigor mortis. They thought I was wrong on the caller, but the other dispatchers played it back for them and confirmed it was the old woman who called. The ambulance transferred the hospital and we got the same calls and disbelief from the doctors. But I took a call from a ghost that day. Number 1. Uninvited Guest. Closing off our list is this story which chilled my spine like Sub-Zero. Coming to us from user Parole Model, which hey, by the way, love the pun. It was from an Ask Reddit thread asking, what's the creepiest thing that's ever happened to you? Lots and lots and lots of good ones, but this one took the cake. So lend an ear. I used to visit my friend at her house out in a rural farming area before she moved. I'd sleep over a lot and we'd just hang out and draw. I usually slept in the living room and on the couch, and there were 2 mirrors in the room that were fairly close to the TV. When the TV was off and I was walking by, I started seeing shadows move behind me. I thought it might just be something off the TV screen, and then one evening I walked into the living room to get my sketchbook so I could sketch in her bedroom. I bent over and picked it up, stood up straight, and I looked in the mirror and saw a man behind me. A man standing in the hallway leading to the living room. He was average height, bald, and a bit old. I turned to look at him and no one was there. I turned to look at the mirror again and he was gone. I felt more than a little spooked. Another time we were just sitting in the living room and we heard what sounded like a kid's footsteps running across upstairs quickly. She had 2 adult siblings, but they were out at work leaving us all alone. Around that time I decided to sleep in my friend's room instead of the living room, only to wake up in the middle of the night to see 4 posters slowly get peeled off the wall. No, it wasn't just them falling and dragging each other down. It looked as if someone was carefully unsticking the tape and removing them. The next morning my friend put them back up saying, well, I need to get some better tape. She and her family eventually moved out because they couldn't afford to keep living there anymore. We'd never really talked about anything that had happened in that house, as if talking about it might actually make it worse. But after she moved, I finally confronted her and said it. I said, "Dude, your house was haunted. I hope you knew that." She replied, "Yeah, we knew it was. Some guy and his granddaughter used to live there, but he took her life and then took his own. So it was probably them or something. I never told you because I didn't want to scare you." Later, she would dig out a copy of a news article she got from a local paper about the crime. The picture that went with the article was the exact man I saw all those years ago.
Number 5 on this list is St. Mary's Catholic Church. This is a Catholic church in Nashville, Tennessee that is apparently deeply haunted. World on Fire says there are 3 ghosts rumored to haunt this church and its grounds. One story holds that a priest died during construction of the church. Another story claims that during the Civil War, a Catholic priest serving as a chaplain for the Confederate Army was shot and killed in the church. There's another rumor that the ghost is the spirit of Bishop Richard P.S. Miles, the first bishop of Diocese of Nashville, who died in 1860. He was buried in the church basement and supposedly still haunts his old stomping grounds. According to one story from 1937, a pounding at his bedroom door woke up a priest in the rectory, but he could find no one there. After he fell asleep, he was woken up again, this time by a pounding on the headboard of his bed. There was no one in his room, so the awakening was attributed to supernatural causes by superstitious locals. I can't say that I personally would substitute a ghost pounding on my headboard's wake-up call for a regular alarm clock, but hey, whatever gets you out of bed in the morning, right? Nowadays, the 3 ghosts that wander around here are sort of just part of the church and accepted among those who pray and worship here. Apparently these ghosts are relatively calm and won't cause too much trouble other than the occasional midnight stomping, that is. There was, however, one story where the chaplain for the Confederate Army ghost attacked someone. It happened over 50 years ago now, but apparently a woman and her young son were walking past the church and got bombarded by this ghost. They both managed to get out okay, but they were obviously really shaken up. Now, nobody knows why this ghost did this or what the story was, but we think that this woman and her son were descendants of someone who had dealings with him in real life. Potentially their grandfather killed this man or something along those lines. It's all a bit hazy, but the good thing is that's the only group of people his ghost has ever chosen to attack before. Other than that, these ghosts are just relatively annoying, but they shouldn't cause you too much problems if you go here. Number 4 on this list is the widow. There was a widow who lived in the 20th century who was a very devout Catholic. For some reason, this woman, who we're gonna call Ruth, had a very strong connection to the spirits that were in purgatory. Her story goes like this. The first soul Ruth encountered was her departed husband. He had often been impatient during his bout with cancer and had reproached God. One evening, Ruth heard a voice. That happened almost every evening over a long time when she came in from the stable. Then she suddenly recognizes the voice of her husband, but she isn't quite sure yet. Then she kneels down and just prays the rosary. She recommends her husband in particular. Yes, she thinks, he was often rather impatient. Is that perhaps the reason he must still do penance? A few evenings later, she sees a nebulous apparition right in the middle of the room. She takes holy water and prays, "O Lord, give him eternal rest." It makes her very upset, and then she sees her husband. He speaks quietly. "Don't be afraid, Ruth, it's me. I may come here to ask your help. Pray 3 chaplets each day." And then he was gone. So every day she prays 3 chaplets. Each time she adds, "Good God, forgive my husband his impatience when he suffered." After some weeks, her husband stands again in the middle of the room. He looks well. He's friendly and beautiful. She recalls how he was a young man. He says nothing. He only looks at her so grateful and full of love. Then she asks him, "How are you, Jacob?" He answers clearly and quietly, "I'm fine. I may come soon. I thank you, Ruth. I thank you so much." and after this he never appeared again. So that's a pretty famous story, and Ruth went on to interact with many ghosts like this in purgatory through her life. In fact, some people started to speculate that she may even be a ghost herself as well. Number 3 on this list is the Most Holy Trinity Church. Here we have another Catholic church that's meant for worship, but has been riddled by a haunting. World on Fire says there are a few possible origins of the hauntings that supposedly plague this old parish. One claims that the current church building, built from 1882 to 1885, stands over an old cemetery where some bodies are still buried. Supposedly the ghosts of the folk under the church haunt the building and mysteriously turn lights on and off, open and close doors, and walk back and forth. Or it could just be living people doing those things, since those activities, believe it or not, are not limited to ghosts. The living can also open doors and turn on lights. At least they could last time I checked. Or maybe I'm a ghost and I don't even know it. Anyways, another source of the ghost legend is that one of the first pastors of the church, Monsignor Michael May, passed away in his bedroom and continues to haunt the church grounds. Apparently, visitors hear mysterious steps at all hours of the night, and dogs have been known to stare as if in a trance at the stairs and dining room of the rectory. In all honesty, dogs staring at things, definitely not indisputable ghostly evidence. I mean, I've seen dogs do some weird stuff before, so I don't think that we can prove anything beyond a reasonable doubt based on their activities. However, it is very important to note nonetheless, whenever a big storm is coming, watch what your animals do. I bet that they'll go and hide or act differently right before a massive thunderstorm or a tornado or something. Us humans, we don't even notice it, we don't sense it at all, but they definitely will. This sort of weird sense, it also translates to ghosts as well, so maybe the dog really is seeing something from the afterlife at this church. Number 2 on this list is Annelise Michelle. This is a very sad story where there may not ever have been any ghosts involved, but they sure thought that there was. Wikipedia says, when Michelle was 16, she experienced a seizure and was diagnosed with psychosis caused by temporal lobe epilepsy. Shortly thereafter, she was diagnosed with depression and was treated by a psychiatric hospital. By the time she was 20, she had become intolerant of various religious objects and began to hear voices. Her condition worsened despite medication, and she became suicidal, also displaying other symptoms for which she took medication as well. After the taking of psychiatric medications for 5 years failed to improve her symptoms, Michelle and her family became convinced that she was possessed by a demon. As a result, her family appealed to the Catholic Church for an exorcism. While rejected at first, true priests got permission from the local bishop in 1975. The priests began conducting exorcism sessions, and the parents stopped consulting doctors. Annelise Michelle stopped eating food and died of malnourishment and dehydration after 67 exorcism sessions. Michelle's parents and the 2 Roman Catholic priests were found guilty of negligent homicide and were sentenced to 6 months in jail as well as a fine. This might not be the most terrifying of all of the ghost stories on here, considering the only real ghost involved was the fear that everybody had to begin with. Poor Annelise would have went through absolute agony in her final days when there probably wasn't any paranormal activity to even begin with. And finally, number 1 on this list is St. Rita's Church. Several decades ago, there was one heck of a ghostly interaction that went down at this church. World on Fire says, on All Souls Day in the early 1960s, St. Rita's Parish had a ghostly visitation. More than a dozen parishioners had gathered there to pray when sometime in the early evening the organ began to play by itself. Suddenly, 6 robed monks appeared, 3 wearing black and 3 wearing white. The parishioners attempted to flee, but they found the doors of the church were locked. The phantom monks moved towards the parishioners while the organ continued its dirge. Finally, the vision faded as a disembodied voice whispered, "Pray for us." So next time you see a ghost, it probably just wants to ask you a favor and hopefully not kill you. All they were asking for was a little prayer, which I think everyone would have been more than happy to indulge with at that time. Of course, having a bunch of ghost monks show up out of nowhere, lock all of the doors, and keep you in there, that's pretty terrifying. Everyone is still very wary around St. Rita's Church in case these monks ever do come back.